Welcome to the Flight Levels. Today, we're going through Joe's Air Traffic Control Knowledge Challenge. Do you have what it takes? Today, we're going to go through several questions that I'm going to try to stump you on, and then we'll go through all the answers and see how many you got right. Let's get to it. So, let's get right to it. The first one, here is an image of a air traffic controller's potential radar scope. And I want you guys to focus on the two targets of American 441, their level at flight level 300, as well as this other target, number 90881 Papa, who you can see is climbing up to flight level 350, but presently at flight level 2902. The question is, what is the best way to resolve this conflict? Okay, moving on to the next question. So, we all know that there are designated skydive areas across the United States. The question is, when you are an air traffic controller, do you need to have your traffic avoid these skydive areas at all times? Can you ever let an aircraft fly through a skydive area? Let me know. Okay, next question has to do with an unusual acronym, which is a ALTRAV, or spell that out, it stands for an altitude reservation. The question is, who are these for? Okay, next one. Let's say you are VFR participating in flight following. Do you need to let the controller you're talking to know before you enter a military operations area or a MOA? Okay, so similar question. Instead of a MOA, how about an alert area? Do you need to let the radar controller know before you enter one? Okay, next question, still on this military theme. Can you request practice IFR approaches at a military Air Force base? All right, moving right along. So let's say you are performing an IFR training flight and you're filing real flight plans. And let's say you're going to start at airport A, you're going to fly over to airport B, do an approach or two, and then you're going to fly back to airport A. Some people call this a round robin flight. Should you file a single IFR flight plan that shows you going up to airport B and then back to airport A? Or is it better if you file two completely separate IFR flight plans? Let me know. Moving right along. In previous videos, we've talked about how while IFR, you can request a block altitude from your controller. The question is, how much extra work is it for an air traffic controller to accommodate your block altitude? Do they need to do any extra work? Okay, next. We know that the regulations specify that we have appropriate altitudes for our direction of flight. Essentially, if you're going eastbound, you need to be at an odd altitude, or if you're going westbound, you need to be at an even altitude while IFR. The question is, are there any exceptions to this? Could you ever be approved to fly at an altitude that is not in accordance with this rule? Great. So now let's talk about air traffic controllers providing air traffic control services to non-towered airports. We like to use the phrase one in, one out, meaning that you can only ever have one aircraft either going into the airport or one aircraft going out. My question is, can a controller legally have more than one IFR aircraft on approach to a single non-towered airport? Or even further, could a controller have an aircraft released for departure while one is cleared for the approach? Let me know. Great. Next question. We all know that it is a very specific instruction you need to receive before entering Class Bravo airspace while VFR. Now, we usually get that clearance from the TRACON controller. The question for you is, can you ever request a Class Bravo clearance and receive such a clearance from a center controller? Okay, so this next one, we're going to take a look at this chart here of Sacramento, California. And let's take a look at this route line from Livermore up to McClellan. So let's say you are flying along with flight following with NorCal TRACON. And at this point right here, let's say NorCal TRACON sees that you're appropriately, around 10 miles away from McClellan Airport. And they know that you need to be on the CTAF to report your positions around 10 miles away. So the radar controller says, hey, radar service terminated, squawk VFR, frequency change approved. See you later. The question is, can you now descend through that Class Charlie shelf on your way down to McClellan Airport? And then last question for today. Since we are here, let's take a look at this sectional of McClellan Airfield. We can see we have Class Echo surface area by this magenta line, but why did they bother splitting the Class E surface area in two halves? What is the difference between the northwest quadrant and the southeast quadrant? Okay, here come the answers to Joe's air traffic control challenge. How many do you think you guys got right? All right, starting with the first one. Taking a look at this snapshot of time on this radar scope. Now, it is very common for controllers to see a situation like this and see like, aha, November 9881 Papa is only 200 feet above flight level 290, which if they stopped them at flight level 290, bada bing, we have our 1,000-foot separation with American 441. The problem with that strategy is that every time a controller is looking at their radar scope, they are always looking a few seconds into the past. So everything has always moved on from this, both in terms of altitude changes and in terms of lateral movement of every aircraft. The other element is aircraft, especially high-performance jets, have a ton of mass, and it takes a lot of time and energy to make them change their trajectory, whether that's in terms of climbing or turning or anything really. So when controllers see a situation like this and they say, hey, November 9881 Papa, stop your climb immediately, return to flight level 290, by the time they say this, the plane's probably already at flight level 295 or higher. And then by the time they actually level off and start going down, they're above flight level 300. So in a situation like this, I would call the traffic and just keep November 9881 Papa climbing. And if they are able to expedite their climb, that would be helpful. But if your answer was to have November 9881 Papa descend back down to flight level 290, you are absolutely wrong. If you said we need to just keep November 9881 Papa climbing, then that is the way to go. If anything, we could have 881 Papa turn to the left to go behind American 441. But really, vertical separation is going to be your friend in this instance. Okay, next question. Do controllers need all of their traffic to avoid skydive areas? The answer is not all the time. And the reason for this is that skydive companies have letters of agreement with the radar controllers that they're flying through. And it basically says that they have to announce to the radar controller every time they're going to jump, and even more so, they have to give them a couple minutes of heads up that this jump is about to happen. So during the time of skydivers jumping, yes, the controller needs to have aircraft clear of the skydive area, but other than that time, it's as if it's not even there. So it's not a big deal. Aircraft can absolutely fly through skydive areas if you're on flight following with the radar controller, because the radar controller is going to ensure that nobody is in there when skydive operations are actually happening. Okay, so the question about an altitude reservation, or more commonly called an ALTRAV, that's going to be used by the military. It's basically when there are pretty big operations of, several aircraft in formation flying, across the country, and they just want to give the controllers a heads up like, hey, we're coming, we're a big group of airplanes, and since we're telling you we're coming, don't delay us. So it's basically just a heads up for controllers that we're coming, we're going to be on this block of altitudes, we're going to be on this route, don't let anyone get in our way. That's what an altitude reservation or an ALTRAV is, and who's going to use it. Okay, next, when you are on flight following and you're VFR, do you need to tell the controller you're about to enter a MOA? No, you do not. And do you know why? Because they don't care. The controller only needs to keep IFR aircraft outside of MOAs. If you're VFR, you have every right in the world to enter a MOA, and that is totally your discretion. Now, if you want to ask the controller if the MOA is hot or not, yeah, they're happy to share that information with you, but you do not need permission to go into the MOA, and the controller doesn't care if you do or not. Okay, moving on to the alert area. This is even more hilarious because the controller's reaction to a question like, hey, can I go to the alert area? The reaction the controller's probably going to have is, what's an alert area? The reason for that is alert areas are never hot or cold. They're just kind of advisory areas that there's a higher concentration of training exercises happening, whether from civilian or military. And since they're never hot or cold, they're not depicted on controllers' radar screens, and the controllers don't care about them. So if you ask a controller about them, they don't care. Okay, can you request practice approaches at a US military airbase? Absolutely, yes. You pay lots of money in taxes. Taxes goes to the military, and you can use the resources that your taxes pay for. And that includes using air traffic control services at military air bases. Now, some exceptions to this are, there are some air bases inside restricted areas that you can't go into the restricted area. But other than airspace that you cannot go in, if you're already allowed in such airspace, you can absolutely use the services that they offer. Now, is it possible that they are busy doing other things and they deny your request? Yes, that can happen just like any civilian air traffic control facility. But are you out of your mind to go request practice approaches with a military TRACON? No. I say go for it. Great. Now on to the question about filing round-robin IFR flight plans. And this one hits home to me as an automation specialist out of Center, because when folks file a single IFR flight plan from Airport A, they go over to Airport B, fly some approaches, and then they return back to Airport A. This jacks up the automation in horrible, horrible ways. And the reason for that is the air traffic control automation system is designed around an airplane taking off from one airport and essentially flying straight to their destination and then terminating the flight plan. So when you file a single round-robin flight plan, what ends up happening is your first leg to get to Airport B goes great. This is exactly what the automation is designed for. But then when you do your practice approaches, or a single one or multiple, you spend a good bit of time just kind of loitering. And in the meantime, the flight plan is still processing. So the flight plan is essentially in the background, having you continue your flight back to your airport A when you're still doing practice approaches at airport B. And when the physical airplane and the, let's call it the logical airplane, are in different places, all sorts of automation problems happen. So the bottom line is, if you're doing IFR training and you're going to go do practice approaches at another airport using an actual IFR flight plan, using an actual IFR clearance, please, please, please file separate IFR flight plans for each leg that you're going to do that day. Moving on, let's talk about block altitudes. So it does require a little bit of extra work for the controller. First off, they have to separate you with more altitudes. When you're just on a hard single altitude, it's pretty simple to separate you by 1,000 feet above or below you. When you're a block altitude, the controller needs to separate 1,000 feet above and below the limits of your block altitude. But even more so, the regulations require every single handoff made for you, the controller needs to have some form of coordination with the controller they're handing off to. Now, in the past, that meant picking up the landline and calling the next controller and saying like, hey, by the way, I've got this guy, he's got this block altitude of this altitude to this altitude, and the controller has the prerogative to say unable, like maybe they need those altitudes for other traffic. But most of the time they'll say, approved, and then they'll take the handoff and move on. Now, thankfully, with some technology advancements and letter of agreement changes, the controllers can now use what's called AIT procedures. And this basically is an agreement saying that, like, for example, let's say you hand off to the next sector, the controller receiving the handoff is going to look at the altitude. They're going to see that it's a block altitude. If they accept this handoff, then that means coordination has occurred. But that arrangement only happens if there's a pre-existing arrangement agreeing to such procedures. So long story short, yes, block altitudes do require more work for controllers. Next, let's talk about inappropriate altitude for direction of flight. And the answer is, you can absolutely be at inappropriate altitude for direction of flight. Controllers likely use these very frequently. However, again, you do have to do coordination every time you do a handoff with inappropriate altitude for direction of flight. But as long as nobody else is using the altitude, who cares? It's not a big deal. It's really more of guidance, and it eliminates a lot of traffic conflicts by flying at appropriate altitudes for direction of flight, but it is by no means a requirement, other than it adds a layer of adding coordination. Great, so the next one is at non-towered airports, the one in, one out concept. And while in general, controllers use one in, one out philosophies, it is not a requirement. The only requirements controllers have is to provide some form of separation. And as we've talked about on this channel, there's lots of ways to apply separation. The most common one today is radar separation. So it is very common to, for example, you could have some plane inbound to a non-towered airport. They're pretty far out, and you can clear them for the approach. At the same time, you're going to hold on to them on your frequency. You're not going to allow them to change frequencies yet. In the meantime, somebody calls up at the airport requesting a IFR release. You issue them that release, preferably with a clearance void time, so you're not clogging up the airport. And via radar, you can see the plane depart, and you can monitor the plane on the approach. And as long as you still have radar separation, this is not a problem at all. You can even have multiple aircraft on the same approach at the same time, again, as long as you're providing some form of separation. That's the main key. Okay, now we're on to the question about Class Bravo airspace clearances. So of course, if you're IFR, this isn't a thing, you're automatically cleared in. But if you're VFR, you need to get that very clear instruction that you are cleared into Class Bravo airspace. So the answer is that no, center controllers cannot authorize Class Bravo airspace entries. And the reason for that is because Class Bravo airspace provides specific Class Bravo services, and centers are not able to provide those services. TRACONs using STARS automation are the only ones that are able to provide Class Bravo services. Now, in a stretch, like I doubt anyone went this far, but in theory, I bet this has probably never happened, but in theory, a pilot could ask a center controller like, hey, can I get a Class Bravo clearance at 7,500 feet? In theory, the center controller could call up the TRACON controller on the landline and say, hey, I got this guy coming through on this route at 7,500 feet. Can we clear him through the Bravo? The TRACON controller is actually the one authorizing it, and he could, through the landline, relay that this authorization is approved, and then the center controller could say, yep, you're cleared through the Class Bravo airspace at such altitude. So in theory that could happen, but really it was the TRACON controller that gave the authorization. The center controller just moved their lips and made some noises. Okay, on to some tricky questions here. So looking at our sectional here of Sacramento. So if we were to talk straight up interpretation of the regs, no, you are not authorized to descend through the Sacramento International Class Charlie shelf there, because what are the requirements to enter Class Charlie airspace? You need to establish two-way radio communication. Since the NorCal TRACON controller said radar service terminated squawk VFR, frequency change approved, we no longer have two-way radio communication, and hence you are not authorized to descend through the Class Charlie shelf. However, I will say I have personal experience flying this exact route, and I have been in this exact situation, hence I came up with this question. And I've asked the NorCal controllers about this, and they're like, bro, we were just talking to you. We can see you, like, it's cool, don't worry about it. So as long as you have that conversation saying, I'm going to descend through it, is that cool with you? And they say, yeah, no problem, you're probably covered. But without that conversation, technically, if you do not have two-way communication, you cannot go through Class Charlie airspace. Okay, then the last question. Get ready for the comments section to explode because you guys are going to hate me. So if we zoom out on this sectional, although this line dividing the McClellan Class E surface area does look like the exact same line depicting the boundary of it, we can see this is the isogonic line showing how much magnetic variation we have through the area of 13 degrees east, and hence it has nothing to do with the boundaries of the Class E surface area. You're welcome. How did you guys do on the first episode of Joe's Air Traffic Control Trivia Challenge? Did any of you get everything right? Let me know in the comments. All right, we'll see you guys next week. Be sure to check out flight-levels.com, and remember, don't just fly, climb to the flight levels.